Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to part 3 of today's lecture on mass politics. This portion will focus on Great Britain in the period of 1870 to 1914. So the 19th century of Great Britain, especially the later 19th century, is frequently referred to as the Victorian age because of the longevity and stability of the monarch Queen Victoria, who you see here on the right. Now, Great Britain actually had a very good century in the 19th century. This is really one of their golden ages. The 19th century is frequently referred to as the British century. And this is because of their continuing economic growth and their political stability, especially in comparison to the continental countries. Britain had avoided the revolutions of 1848 because of necessary reforms they had made to prevent that type of instability. And as a result, they saw political stability during the second half of the 19th century. Real wages for laborers and the working class increased more than 25% in the period of 1850 to 1870. This is also a period where there was expanded democracy in Great Britain. Voting restrictions were greatly reduced, and the working class enjoyed more economic prosperity. Queen Victoria, as I mentioned, represented a sense of duty and moral responsibility. Essentially, she communicated a sense of national pride, and her longevity symbolized the stability of the monarchy as Victoria ruled Britain from 1837 to 1901. The middle class of Britain also saw Queen Victoria as a reflection of their own values. She was religious, she was modest, she was demure, and of course she had that sense of duty and national loyalty. However, Queen Victoria was more of a cultural icon. She did not have any significant influence on the politics of the period. That's going to be defined more by these two sort of rival prime ministers in Britain, Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone, who we'll learn about here in just a moment. Now, between 1850 and 1865, there was a realignment of Britain's political parties. The Whig Party, which you might remember, became known as the Liberal Party. So the Whigs became the Liberal Party, and they were led by William Gladstone. And then the Tories became known as the Conservative Party, and they were led by Benjamin Disraeli. The Conservatives now favored an aggressive foreign policy, which included the expansion of the British Empire and reluctantly supporting liberal reforms that would support economic development and strengthen the government. Whereas the Liberal Party tended to still promote economic and political liberalism. And we'll talk more about their values here in a moment. But what's important to note is that Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone were political opponents with each other for a few decades, because if the Conservative Party had the majority in Parliament, then Disraeli would be the Prime Minister. And then usually the next election might bring in a Liberal victory, and then William Gladstone got to be the Prime Minister. And there was a bit of flip-flopping there for a few decades. Now, in the 1860s, there were many calls from the British people and representatives to expand voting and suffrage in Great Britain. And so Benjamin Disraeli, the Prime Minister for the Conservative Party, was motivated to win over the support of the working class, right? And so as a result, he passed this major piece of legislation that is known as the Reform Act of 1867. It's also known as the Second Reform Act, sort of building upon the Reform Act of 1830. And this is considered Benjamin Disraeli's big leap in the dark. Now, he had been influenced by John Stuart Mill's book on liberty, which had really been one of the most influential books on the necessity to increase democracy, especially in Britain. And this Second Reform Act is a really important step in the long-term process of democratizing Great Britain. As I said, it was expansion of the Reform Bill of 1832. Sorry, 1832, not 1830. Now, the central goal in Disraeli's domestic agenda was winning the working class support for the Conservative Party. And he felt that if the Conservative Party were the ones to provide them the right to vote, then they would show their gratitude by voting for and supporting conservatives. So in this reform bill, almost all men over the age of 21 who lived in urban areas were granted the right to vote. This essentially doubled the number of men who could vote, but it still fell short of universal suffrage in the rural regions of Great Britain. It also had redistributed seats to provide equitable representation in the House of Commons, again, providing representation to areas that might previously have been underrepresented. And ironically, this did not lead to a lot of working class support for the Conservatives. In fact, the next year, in 1868, it led to a huge liberal victory, and the Conservatives were now in the minority. This also, of course, led to more conflict between the political parties, and the political parties in Great Britain developed a better organization and discipline as they competed for seats and for elections. So Disraeli's Reform Act was successful in that it expanded the right to vote, but it was not successful because those new voters did not support the Conservatives. And now we have the Liberals in charge under William Gladstone. So William Gladstone was the Liberal Prime Minister of Great Britain intermittently between the 1860s and 1890s. He is considered to be one of the most important liberal figures in 19th century England. The Liberal Party under Gladstone's leadership supported values like Irish home rule, fiscal policy, free trade, and extending democratic principles, but they also opposed imperialism. Under Gladstone's leadership, the Liberal Party implemented a series of impressive liberal reforms. For example, they abolished compulsory taxes that supported the Church of England. They also opened civil service positions to competitive exams rather than just patronage, so that civil service positions in the government were now determined based on ability and not connections. And the Australian Ballot Act of 1832 introduced a secret ballot for voting in Great Britain. You may remember that the secret ballot was an early demand of the Chartist movement back in the 1830s. Beyond this, the Liberals also passed the Education Act of 1870, which made elementary schools available for all children. And then they would pass the Third Reform Bill of 1884. And the Third Reform Bill of 1884 expanded suffrage even more, providing the right to vote for almost every adult male all across Great Britain. Now, the new challenge to the Liberals actually did not come from the Conservatives. It came from a new political group known as the Labour Party. During the 1880s and the 1890s, new groups emerged in English politics that wanted to further expand democracy. This included women's suffrage advocates, who we'll learn about more shortly, anti-imperialist groups, socialists, and other anti-nationalists. Trade unions and socialists, who tended to have the best connection, began calling for more reform that would benefit the working class. These trade unions and socialists, however, were moderate. They favored evolutionary socialism through democratic means. And so this led to the creation of the Labour Party in Great Britain in the year 1900. So the Labour Party in Great Britain became essentially their socialist party. And because of the threat of the Labour Party, the Liberal Party actually had to abandon some of their more traditional liberal values like laissez-faire economics. And as a result, they advanced more aggressive social and economic programs to stay in power and implemented important social welfare measures between 1906 and 1914. This included things like creating the National Health Insurance Program, providing unemployment benefits, old age pensions, which is essentially retirement, allowing unions the right to strike, and creating compulsory school attendance for state-run public schools. Now, by the time the Liberals were promoting this more social welfare package, William Gladstone had been replaced by a new leader of the party, David Lloyd George, the next Prime Minister of Britain, in the early 20th century. And under the leadership of David Lloyd George, the Liberal Party was relatively transformed to adopt more social welfare policies. They increased taxes on the wealthy to pay for these reforms, to pay for health insurance, to pay for retirement and things like that. Now, the House of Lords, which was full of hereditary aristocrats, obviously opposed a lot of these measures. They did not want to pay for these social welfare programs. And so in response, David Lloyd George was able to pass the Parliament Act of 1911. And the Parliament Act is one of the most significant political reforms during Liberal Party rule because it essentially eliminated the powers of the House of Lords. And now the House of Commons was the center of national power in the British government. Now, the Liberal Party will be able to stay in power for at least a few more years up until World War I, but the Labour Party will continue to be a very important and powerful force in British politics all throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. The last topic I want to discuss in Europe and British politics during this period is the question of Ireland and what is going on with Ireland at the time period. Now, you might remember that Ireland has been controlled and frankly exploited by the British for centuries, and as a result, the Irish people hated the British, absolutely hated the British. So by the later 19th century, Ireland had developed a sense of national consciousness, much like many other European states. And they continued to detest and resent the absentee British landlords and their burdensome rents. And of course, the travesty of the Irish potato famine had done nothing to endear the British to the Irish. Shortly after the potato famine, in fact, a nationalist movement called Young Ireland, much like Young Italy, had emerged as a nationalist movement for young people, and they advocated for independence for Ireland from Great Britain. And it turns out that the Irish question, which was whether or not Ireland should gain independence, was one of the most recurring and serious problems that the British government faced between 1890 and 1914. And gradual reform had not solved any of the problems, right? None of the problems had been reformed through simple reform and bills and things like that. William Gladstone had been an early supporter of Irish Home Rule and had pushed for it unsuccessfully in Parliament. Specifically, Irish Home Rule is not just independence of Ireland, but it allows Ireland to have its own parliament, which it had not had since the year 1801, when the Act of Union had actually united the English and Irish parliaments. Now, this may seem like something that the majority of the people of Ireland want, but it's important to remember that Ireland was very divided. While most of the main island of Ireland was Catholic, Northern Ireland continued to be very Protestant and was much more loyal to Britain. This is a region sometimes referred to as Ulster, the Protestant counties in Northern Ireland. These counties opposed Irish Home Rule because they did not want to be ruled by Irish Catholics, and also they were enjoying remarkable economic growth in the 1890s. And so the people of Northern Ireland actually raised their own army, and they also were supported by British public opinion, right? Because the British and the people of Northern Ireland were both Protestant, and they had a lot more in common with each other than the Catholics of the rest of Ireland. Now, in 1914, the Irish Home Rule Act was passed by the House of Commons and Lords in Britain, but the Protestants in the North refused to accept it. This led to some significant conflict and tension, and ultimately, the implementation of the Irish Home Rule Act was deferred until after World War I, because World War I would also begin in 1914. But the people of Ireland, the Catholics, were not willing to wait until the war was over. And so, even during World War I, there were some moments of violence and rebellion in Ireland against Britain. One of the most famous events is known as the Easter Rebellion, which occurred in 1916, which was a rebellion in the city of Dublin as this group of Irish nationalists demanded Irish independence. However, this movement was crushed by British troops. There would continue to be violence and conflict even following World War I, until finally in 1922, Ireland gained its independence from Great Britain. And the caveat is that Northern Ireland, which is now a separate country from the rest of Ireland, remained part of the British Empire. Now, another important political development in England during this period is the development of women's rights and the suffrage movement. Even though women will not gain the right to vote until after World War I, the emergence of women's politics during this period is another effect of mass politics and many of the other conditions that we have been discussing. Initially, women wanted to amend marriage and property laws that discriminated against females. For example, existing laws in Britain allowed men to divorce if their wife had committed adultery, but a woman could not secure a divorce from a man for infidelity unless she had been subject to physical abuse, cruelty, or desertion as well. Existing laws also prohibited women from inheriting property from their parents unless there was no male heir. And a leading advocate for these early sort of women's politics was a woman named Barbara Smith Bodicon, Bodicon. Barbara Smith Bodicon campaigned in the 1850s for increased property rights for women by founding one of the first women's rights organizations, and later worked towards access for women to universities. So initially, the women's political movement was about amending divorce laws, property inheritance, and access to higher education. But by the 1890s, women's suffrage, meaning the ability to vote, became the focus for many of these activists. Women's rights activists realized that suffrage was ultimately the key to remedying all these other problems. They argued that men had not done enough to protect women from exploitation and abuse over the years. However, many people believed that the female influence in public affairs would serve as a balance to the masculine qualities that presently dominated politics. So many people maybe were supportive of women having the right to vote. However, there were also fears that feminism might upset nationalistic patriotism. Some people did not think that feminism and nationalism were compatible. And in a fairly sort of socially conservative society, feminist goals tended to be associated with people who had unorthodox views, and their behavior was considered out of the mainstream. So there's going to be many strong and powerful obstacles to the success of women's suffrage in Britain and elsewhere. Many of the early suffragettes, who were women's rights activists, came largely from the middle class. These middle class women benefited from education. Many of them were exposed to earlier feminist works from Harriet Taylor or Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill. Also, many middle-class families had servants, which gave women the time to become activists. Whereas working-class women and socialists tended to distrust the middle class, so there was no class camaraderie in the feminist movement. Working-class women generally worked towards their goals independently of middle-class women. And the most advanced women's movement was in Great Britain at the time, and they shared many sentiments with their American contemporaries, such as Susan B. Anthony. Now, one prominent leader in the women's suffrage movement who represents the more moderate views was Millicent Garrett Fawcett. Millicent Garrett Fawcett was the leader of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. And again, she represents the more moderate approach to women's suffrage. She demanded that Parliament grant female suffrage, but she also wanted to work through democratic means. She helped grow the suffrage movement and played a role in national and international suffrage concerns leading up to the World War and after. So she would not take extreme measures, but instead you can think of her more as like the evolutionary socialist, the more moderate version of women's suffrage and their activism. And in fact, she was knighted by the monarchy in 1924 for her efforts. However, the more famous suffragettes were militant and much more radical and demanding, and they were led by the famous feminist leader Emmeline Pankhurst. These more militant suffragettes were infuriated that Parliament would not give women the right to vote, even though women in Finland and Norway had gained the right to vote before World War I. So along with her daughter Sylvia, Emmeline Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, based on militant principles. And they would take much more extreme and violent tactics to achieve their goals. So beginning in 1907, the WSPU undertook violent activities such as destroying railroad stations or works of art and store windows. Suffragettes might chain themselves to the gates in front of Parliament. At the very least, they organized parades and demonstrations. You can see an example of one of those in the upper right corner. That's Emmeline Pankhurst leading a demonstration in Trafalgar Square in the middle of London. Now, many men actually disapproved of these tactics, and some men would even go so far as to attack and restrain the female marchers. And a number of these female militants were arrested for their activities. Some went on hunger strikes in prison and were force-fed by the authorities. But this, of course, caused public outrage. These force feedings caused public outrage. And so in response, Parliament passed something called the Cat and Mouse Act that would free the starved female prisoners from jail until they had regained their health, and then they would be arrested again and returned to jail. But perhaps the most notorious militant action of the suffragettes occurred when Emily Davison committed suicide by throwing herself in front of the King's horse at the Epsom Derby in 1913. So if you look at the picture on the lower right, that is Emily Davison committing suicide by throwing herself in front of a horse during the Derby. Now, women would finally be granted the right to vote in Great Britain with the Representation of the People Act, which was passed in 1918. As a result of women's critical contributions to the war effort during World War I, Parliament gave women over 30 the right to vote, and this would be expanded to women over the age of 21 by 1928. But this was just in Great Britain. Women's suffrage movements in Europe on the continent were much different and tended to have even less support than we would see in, say, Great Britain or the United States. French feminists tended to reject any form of radical tactics or violence. They did not hold mass rallies, they did not have an organized movement, and as a result, French women did not get the right to vote until after World War II. And in Germany, women were forbidden by law from political activity, as their political participation was seen as subversive to the needs of the state. One of the only groups that tended to support women's suffrage and women's rights were the socialists, because the socialists supported the rights for the working class, and they did not see a difference or discrimination between the rights of women and the rights of men. However, Most European countries would grant women the right to vote after World War I during some point in the 1920s. So that concludes part 3 of today's lecture on mass politics. Please stay tuned for part 4, which will be about Germany and Italy.